The deep silence of space surrounded the human exploration ship, Starlight Voyager, as it glided through the darkness. Captain Reed sat in his command chair, his eyes fixed on the large screen in front of him. The crew had been searching the galaxy for any signs of life after a distress signal was received from an unknown planet. No one knew what they would find, but Reed had a feeling this mission was going to be different from the others. "Captain, we're entering the planet's atmosphere," said First Officer Hale, her fingers flying over the controls. The planet below looked deserted, with broken cities and collapsed buildings visible through the clouds. The ship shook as it descended, but the crew was calm. They had done this 100 times before. "Any life signs, Hale?" Reed asked, leaning forward in his chair. Hale scanned the surface. "Barely anything, sir. There's one small signal near the ruins. It could be some kind of creature, but it's hard to say." Reed nodded. "Take us down. Let's check it out." The ship landed gently on the ground, and a team of 6, led by Captain Reed, prepared to explore. As the airlock door opened, they were hit with a gust of wind. The land was cold, and the sky was dark with gray clouds. The ruins of what once looked like a great city stretched out in all directions. The buildings were tall, but most were crumbled, as if something had destroyed the place long ago. "Stay close," Reed ordered as they moved forward, their boots crunching on the broken ground. As they made their way deeper into the city, something caught their attention. It was a faint sound, like a small voice. Reed held up his hand, signaling the team to stop. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Hale nodded. "It's coming from over there, in that building." The team moved carefully toward the source of the sound. The building was half destroyed, with large chunks of debris blocking most of the entrances. But there was a narrow opening in one corner. Without a word, Reed and Hale squeezed through the gap. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a hole in the ceiling. Dust floated in the air, and the floor was covered in rubble. But then, in the far corner of the room, Reed saw something that made his heart skip a beat. 2 small figures huddled together, barely visible in the shadows. They were not human. Their skin had a soft, pale glow, and their eyes were large and dark. They looked like children, though their alien features made it clear they were from a different world. The 2 girls, because that's what they seemed to be, stared at Reed and Hale, their eyes wide with fear. They were trembling, their small bodies wrapped in torn cloth that looked like it once belonged to someone important. "Are they children?" Hale whispered, stepping closer. Reed nodded slowly. "I think so. They look like they've been here for a long time." One of the girls moved slightly, pulling the other closer as if to protect her. Reed knelt down, lowering his weapon. He knew they had to be careful. These weren't enemies. They were survivors. "It's okay," Reed said gently. "We're not going to hurt you." The girls didn't respond, but they didn't run either. Reed slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a blanket, offering it to them. The older of the 2 hesitated, then cautiously reached out and took it, wrapping it around herself and the younger one. "We need to get them back to the ship," Hale said softly. "They look weak." Reed nodded. "Agreed. Let's bring them to safety." As the team carefully escorted the 2 alien girls back to the ship, Reed couldn't help but wonder what had happened to them. How had they ended up here, alone on a dead planet? Where were their people? Back on the Starlight Voyager, the girls were given medical care and food, though they ate little. The ship's doctor, Dr. Lin, checked their vitals and confirmed they were stable, but they had been through a lot. The crew tried to communicate with them, but the girls didn't speak any language they knew. Still, there was something in their eyes, something intelligent, something sad. "Captain, who do you think they are?" Hale asked as they watched the girls rest in the medical bay. Reed shook his head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He turned back toward the control room, knowing that this discovery was just the beginning of a much bigger mystery. A new home on Earth. The 2 alien girls sat quietly in the corner of the transport ship, their large dark eyes staring out the window. Earth was in sight now, glowing like a blue marble against the blackness of space. The Starlight Voyager had been in flight for weeks, bringing the girls to their new home. Captain Reed watched them from across the room. They had been so silent ever since the rescue, and he couldn't help but feel for them. They must have been through so much. "Captain, the adoption process has been completed," First Officer Hale said, walking up to Reed. "The girls will be staying with the Brooks family. They live in a quiet part of the countryside." Reed nodded. The Brooks family had a reputation for taking in children in need. They had raised several human kids already, and now they were ready to care for these two alien girls. It was a perfect fit. As the ship landed, the girls clung to each other, their thin hands gripping tightly. They had no idea what Earth was like, and everything felt strange and new. When the door opened, a soft breeze greeted them. The air smelled of fresh grass and flowers, a welcome change from the cold, lifeless planet they had come from. Outside, a couple stood waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks were both in their 40s, with warm smiles and gentle eyes. Mrs. Brooks, with her soft brown hair tied back, waved to the girls as they stepped out of the ship. "Hello there," Mrs. Brooks said in a kind voice. "We've been waiting to meet you." The girls didn't say anything, just looked at her cautiously. They didn't understand her words, but they could feel the kindness in her tone. Mr. Brooks, tall and bearded, gave them a nod and smiled, carrying a small toy in his hand. It was a stuffed animal, meant to comfort them. "Come on now, let's get you settled," Mr. Brooks said, reaching out his hand. The older girl hesitated, then slowly took his hand. The younger one followed, clutching the stuffed animal tightly. Together, the Brooks family led the girls to their new home, a cozy house with a wide yard surrounded by trees. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. The living room had soft couches, and the kitchen smelled of fresh bread. The girls were shown to their room, which was painted a soft blue with two small beds. Toys and books were neatly placed on shelves, waiting for them. "This is your room now," Mrs. Brooks said softly. "You can stay here as long as you want." The older girl glanced at the younger one, and they both nodded slowly. They were still afraid, still unsure of everything. But they felt safe here, at least for now. Days passed, and the girls began to settle into their new life. At first, they didn't speak much. They watched everything around them, trying to understand this strange new world. They followed the Brooks family closely, mimicking their actions and learning slowly. The Brooks family did their best to teach them. Mrs. Brooks would sit with them at the table, showing them how to use simple utensils and helping them learn basic words in English. "This is bread," she would say, holding up a slice. "Bread." The younger girl would repeat the word softly, "bread." The older one, more cautious, would watch carefully but say little. As time went on, the girls grew more comfortable. They began playing in the yard, exploring the garden, and even drawing pictures on scraps of paper. Mrs. Brooks hung their drawings on the fridge, proud of their progress. The girls still didn't talk much, but they smiled more now. And that was a big step forward. But even though they were adapting, there was something different about these girls. Mrs. Brooks noticed it one evening while she was making dinner. The younger girl was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a spoon. Then, without touching it, the spoon began to move, sliding slowly across the table. Mrs. Brooks gasped softly but didn't say anything. She didn't want to frighten the girl. She knew they were special, but seeing their abilities up close made her realize just how different they were. The girls didn't talk about their past, but their powers were a reminder that they came from somewhere far beyond Earth. Still, the Brooks family treated them like any other children. They were patient, giving them time to adjust and heal from whatever trauma they had experienced. The girls, for their part, grew to trust their new parents. Slowly but surely, they were becoming part of the family. One night, as Mrs. Brooks tucked them into bed, the younger girl whispered a single word in English. "Thank you." Mrs. Brooks smiled and kissed her forehead. "You're welcome, sweetheart. You're home now." The girls still had a long journey ahead, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they belonged somewhere. Earth was strange and different, but it was becoming home. Strange powers are to show. Months passed, and the alien girls began to feel more at home with the Brooks family. They had grown comfortable with Earth, learning how to live like humans. The older girl, now called Mira, and the younger one, whom they named Leela, started to open up more. They played outside in the garden, helped with chores around the house, and even began picking up more English. The Brooks family was happy to see the progress, but they knew deep down that the girls were different, more than just from another planet. One sunny afternoon, Mira and Leela were in the backyard playing with a ball. They had learned to throw and catch like the other kids at school. Mr. Brooks was watching from the porch, smiling as they laughed and chased the ball across the grass. Suddenly, something unusual happened. Mira threw the ball to Leela, but it went too far. Instead of running after it, Leela held out her hand, and the ball stopped in midair. Mr. Brooks blinked in surprise as he watched the ball float back into Leela's hand. She smiled as if nothing strange had happened and threw it back to her sister. Mr. Brooks stood up, rubbing his eyes. Did he really just see that? He wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light, but it made him uneasy. He decided to keep an eye on the girls, but he didn't mention it to Mrs. Brooks right away. He wanted to be sure before worrying her. A few days later, the girls were inside the house, sitting at the dining table while Mrs. Brooks cooked dinner. She was chopping vegetables when she heard a faint buzzing sound. She turned around and saw Lila staring at a glass of water. The water inside was moving, swirling in circles on its own, as if Lila was controlling it with her mind. Mrs. Brooks gasped, dropping her knife. The sound startled Leela, and the water stopped swirling. She quickly looked away, as if she was scared she'd done something wrong. Mrs. Brooks, trying not to scare the child, knelt down beside her and gently asked, "How did you do that?" Leela shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," she whispered in broken English. Mrs. Brooks smiled, trying to stay calm. "It's okay. You don't have to be scared." But inside, Mrs. Brooks knew this wasn't normal. These girls were not just lost orphans. They had abilities that no human could explain. She decided to talk to her husband about what she saw. That night, as they sat on the porch, Mrs. Brooks told Mr. Brooks what had happened. To her surprise, he nodded and said, "I saw something too." The other day, Leela made the ball float back into her hand without touching it. Mrs. Brooks sighed. "What do we do? Should we tell someone?" Mr. Brooks thought for a moment. "No, not yet. They're just children. I don't think they understand what's happening either. Let's wait and see if it happens again." The next few weeks were filled with more strange events. Mira and Leela were careful, but their powers started to show more and more. One evening, while the family was having dinner, Mira accidentally knocked over a glass. But before it hit the floor, it froze in midair and gently floated back to the table. Everyone stared in shock, and Mira quickly looked down, embarrassed. "It's okay, Mira," Mr. Brooks said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Mira's face was red, but she didn't say anything. She didn't mean to use her powers. It just happened. As the days went by, the girls tried to hide their abilities, but it became harder and harder. They could move objects without touching them, communicate silently with each other, and even understand complex machines just by looking at them. They didn't talk about it, but they knew they were different. One afternoon, Mira was in the garage with Mr. Brooks, helping him fix the old family car. The engine was broken, and Mr. Brooks was having trouble figuring out what was wrong. Mira stood beside him, watching quietly. After a few minutes, she reached out and touched the engine. Her fingers moved over the parts, and suddenly, the engine roared to life. Mr. Brooks stared in disbelief. "How did you do that?" he asked. Mira shrugged. "I just knew," she said softly. The Brooks family realized the girls were not just special, they were extraordinary. But they didn't know how to help them understand their powers. The girls seemed scared of their own abilities, unsure of where they came from or how to control them. Still, the Brooks family didn't treat them any differently. They loved Mira and Leela like their own children, even with all the strange things happening around them. But deep down, they knew something bigger was coming. The girls' powers were growing, and soon, the world would notice. This version keeps the language simple and focuses on building tension as the girls' powers begin to reveal themselves. The Brooks family's love for the girls adds warmth to the story while the mystery around their abilities deepens. A royal search. Far across the galaxy, in a distant and powerful alien empire, the search for two lost princesses had never stopped. For years, the royal family's most trusted guards have been looking for them, following every clue, chasing every rumor. The empire had fallen into chaos since the princesses disappeared. Without their royal leaders, the people were divided, and enemies were closing in, ready to take advantage of the empire's weakness. High Commander Zorak stood on the deck of his massive ship, the Starbreaker, staring at the holographic map in front of him. He had been leading the search for the princesses for as long as he could remember. The two young girls were the key to restoring peace to the empire, and he had sworn an oath to bring them back. A soft beep interrupted his thoughts. It was one of his officers, a tall alien with silver skin and glowing eyes. "Commander, we've picked up a new signal," the officer said. "It's faint, but it matches the royal DNA markers." Zorak's heart raced. Could this finally be the break they were looking for? "Where is the signal coming from?" Zorak asked, his voice calm but full of tension. The officer tapped the controls, and a small planet appeared on the map. It was a blue and green world, far from their usual territory. "Earth," the officer said. "It's a human planet. We've never searched there before." Zorak narrowed his eyes. Earth was a primitive world compared to their empire, but it didn't matter. If the princesses were there, he would find them. He turned to his crew, his voice sharp with command. "Set a course for Earth. We leave immediately." As the Starbreaker sped through the stars, Zorak's mind was racing. The princesses had been missing for so long. He wondered what they would be like now. Were they safe? Did they even remember who they were? Most importantly, would they be ready to return and take their place as rulers of the empire? Meanwhile, back on Earth, Mira and Leela continued to live peacefully with the Brooks family, unaware that their true identity was about to be discovered. Their powers were growing stronger, and though they tried to hide them, strange things kept happening around them. The Brooks family was worried but supportive. They loved the girls like their own and didn't care where they came from. One evening, as the sun was setting, Mira sat on the porch, staring up at the stars. She always felt drawn to the sky, as if something out there was calling her. Leela came and sat beside her, her small hand slipping into Mira's. "Do you ever feel like we're different?" Leela asked quietly. Mira nodded. "Yes, all the time. But I don't know why." Before Leela could respond, a strange sound filled the air. It was low at first, almost like a hum, but it grew louder until it became a deep rumble. The ground trembled, and the air seemed to shimmer around them. "Mira, what's happening?" Leela asked, her voice full of fear. Mira stood up, her heart pounding. She didn't know, but something inside her told her that whatever was happening had to do with them. Suddenly, a large shadow appeared in the sky. It was a ship, sleek, black, and unlike anything the girls had ever seen. It descended slowly, landing in the open field near the house. The Brooks family rushed outside, staring in shock as the ship's doors opened. From the ship, a group of tall, armored figures emerged. Leading them was High Commander Zorak, his sharp eyes scanning the area until they landed on Mira and Leela. "There they are," Zorak said quietly. "The princesses. The words hung in the air like a shockwave. Mira and Leela froze, unable to process what they had just heard. Princesses. Us? Mrs. Brooks stepped forward protectively, placing herself between the girls and the aliens. Who are you? What do you want with them? Zorak didn't take his eyes off Mira and Leela. They are not who you think they are, he said in a deep, commanding voice. These girls are the lost princesses of the Sarathian Empire. They belong to us. The Brooks family was stunned. Princesses. It didn't make any sense, but looking at the fear in Mira and Leela's eyes, Mrs. Brooks knew it had to be true. We're not going anywhere, Mira shouted, grabbing Layla's hand. Zorak stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You don't understand, Your Highnesses. Your people need you. Your empire is falling apart. You are the only ones who can save them. Mira's mind was spinning. Everything she thought she knew about her life was suddenly turned upside down. She looked at Leela, who was trembling beside her. Could they really be royalty? Could they really save an entire empire? The Starbreakers stood waiting, and Zorak's eyes never left them. The choice was now theirs. This version builds suspense with the discovery of the princesses, introduces new characters, and the royal search, while keeping the language simple and the action engaging. The big secret is revealed. Mira and Leela stood frozen in the field as High Commander Zorak's words echoed in their ears. They were princesses, princesses of a powerful alien empire. It didn't feel real. All their lives, they thought they were just orphans from a faraway world. Now, this stranger was telling them they had a destiny to rule a whole empire. The Brooks family, standing protectively beside them, were just as shocked. Mira shook her head, trying to process it all. You're wrong, she said, her voice shaky. We're not princesses. We don't belong to an empire. Zorak's eyes softened for a moment. He had expected this reaction. After all, the girls had been missing for years. They had no memory of their past. You don't remember, Zorak said gently. But you are not ordinary children. You are the daughters of King Valen and Queen Silara of the Sarathian Empire. You were sent away for your safety when the empire was under attack. Mira's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Leela, who looked even more frightened. They were supposed to be safe here on Earth with the Brooks family. But now, everything was changing. The truth about who they really were was unraveling before their eyes. Mrs. Brooks stepped forward, her voice firm. I don't care what you say. These girls are part of our family now. You can't just take them away. Zorak nodded, respecting her courage. I understand your feelings, he said, but they have a responsibility to their people. The Sarathian Empire is in chaos without them. The royal family's bloodline is sacred, and only they can restore peace. Leela, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, her small voice trembling. Why didn't anyone come for us before? Why did they leave us alone for so long? Zorak's face darkened. We tried. For years, we searched every corner of the galaxy, but the enemies who attacked your parents hid you well. It wasn't until recently that we were able to trace your location to Earth. Mira and Leela's eyes met. They had so many questions, but one thing was clear. Their lives were never going to be the same again. They weren't just orphans. They were part of something much bigger. I don't want to go, Leela whispered, tears filling her eyes. This is our home. Mira squeezed her sister's hand. She felt the same. Earth had become their home. The Brooks family had taken them in, loved them like their own daughters. They couldn't imagine leaving now. But deep down, Mira knew there was more to this. The strange powers they had, the feeling that they didn't quite belong. Everything started to make sense now. Zorak took a step closer. I know this is hard, he said, his voice softer now. But your people need you. The Sarathian Empire is on the brink of collapse. Your parents gave their lives to protect you and the Empire. You have a duty to honor their sacrifice. Mira's chest tightened at the mention of their parents. They had no memory of them, but the thought of their parents fighting to save them stirred something inside her. A sense of responsibility, of duty, began to grow. "Do we have to go?" Leela asked, looking up at Mira with wide eyes. Mira didn't know how to answer. She felt torn between the life they had on Earth and the destiny they were just discovering. Could they really turn their backs on their people? But at the same time, how could they leave the only family they had ever known? Before Mira could speak, Mrs. Brooks knelt down in front of them, taking both girls' hands. "You don't have to make this decision right now," she said gently. "Whatever happens, we're here for you. We love you, and that will never change." Tears welled up in Mira's eyes as she looked at Mrs. Brooks. She wanted so badly to stay with them, to live a normal life on Earth. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option anymore. Zorak gave them a moment before he spoke again. "I will give you time to decide," he said. "But understand, the longer you wait, the more your people will suffer. The Cerethian Empire needs its rulers now more than ever." With that, Zorak and his soldiers turned and walked back to their ship, leaving the girls and the Brooks family standing in the field, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth they had just learned. Mira's mind was racing. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She and Leela were not just ordinary girls. They were royalty, and their destiny was calling them, whether they were ready for it or not. This section focuses on the emotional turmoil of the girls as they learn about their royal heritage. It keeps the language simple and builds suspense around their decision, while showing the love and support of the Brooks family. Choosing between two lives. The days that followed the revelation felt like a dream for Mira and Leela. They were caught in a whirlwind of emotions, unsure of what to do next. The news about their royal heritage weighed heavily on them, and every time they thought about it, their hearts raced. They had grown so fond of their life with the Brooks family, but now they were being pulled toward a destiny they had never imagined. One evening, as the sun began to set, Mira and Leela sat together in their room. The walls were decorated with posters of their favorite movies, and their beds were filled with stuffed animals. This was their safe space, but now it felt different. The reality of their situation hung in the air like a thick fog. "Mira, what are we going to do?" Leela asked, her voice small and frightened. "I don't want to leave here. I love it here." Mira nodded, feeling the same fear. "I love it too, Leela. But if we are really princesses, we have to think about our people. They need us." Leela hugged her knees to her chest, staring at the floor. "But what if we're not ready? What if we can't be good princesses?" Mira wrapped her arms around her sister, trying to comfort her. "I don't know. But we can't ignore it. We have powers, and we can help people. We just have to figure out how." They sat in silence for a moment, each girl lost in her thoughts. Mira looked around the room, taking in every detail, the pictures of their adventures, the laughter they shared, the love they felt from the Brooks family. It was hard to think about leaving all of this behind. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Brooks stepped in, a warm smile on her face. "Hey, girls. Can I come in?" "Sure," Mira said, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. Mrs. Brooks sat on the edge of the bed. "I wanted to check on you. How are you feeling?" Mira took a deep breath. "It's hard, Mom. We don't know what to do." Mrs. Brooks nodded, her expression understanding. "I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you both. You have to make a choice, but remember, it's okay to take your time." "But what if we choose wrong?" Leela asked, her eyes wide with worry. "What if we leave and it's terrible? What if we're not who they think we are?" "Whatever you choose, we will support you," Mrs. Brooks said gently. "You are brave and strong. You've already faced so much, and you've grown so much too. But this is your decision to make. Just remember that you're not alone." Mira and Leela exchanged glances, feeling a little more comforted. They appreciated Mrs. Brooks' support, but the decision still felt heavy. "I wish we could just stay here," Leela whispered, her voice trembling. Mira squeezed her sister's hand. Me too, but we can't ignore our past. We have to think about our people. As night fell, the girls lay in bed, staring up at the stars through their window. The shimmering lights felt like a connection to their lost home, a place they had never seen but somehow belonged to. I wonder what it would be like to be a princess, Mira said quietly. To wear beautiful dresses and live in a palace. Do you think we'd have to rule people? Leela asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. What if they don't like us? Mira thought for a moment. Maybe they would like us because we are different. We could bring new ideas, new ways to help them. But we have to learn what it means to be princesses first. Just then, Mira remembered the strange powers they had. They could move things with their minds and communicate without words. Maybe those abilities could help them be the leaders their people needed. The next day, they decided to talk to Zorak. They needed to understand what being a princess meant. They needed to know more about the empire they were supposed to lead. When they approached Zorak, he was waiting for them on the ship. The Starbreaker was sleek and powerful, a true representation of the Sarathian Empire. Commander Zorak, Mira began, her voice steady. We want to learn about our empire. What does it mean to be princesses? How can we help? Zorak nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. I'm glad you have decided to learn. Being a princess is about serving your people. It means using your gifts for the good of your empire. It means leading with kindness and strength. Leela looked up, her eyes wide. What about our powers? Can they help us? Absolutely, Zorak replied. Your powers are unique, and with training, you can learn to use them for the benefit of your people. Together, you will make a great team. Mira and Leela exchanged hopeful glances. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could find a way to balance both worlds. They could be princesses and still keep their hearts with the Brooks family. As they left the ship, Mira felt a spark of determination. They had a big choice to make, but they wouldn't make it alone. They would face this challenge together, no matter what lay ahead. This section explores the girls' internal struggle and highlights the support of the Brooks family, while also building up to the next phase of their journey. It keeps the language simple and engages with their emotional journey. The final decision and battle. The days turned into weeks as Mira and Leela prepared for their new lives as princesses. They spent time on the Starbreaker with Zorak, learning about their powers and the Sarathian Empire. They trained hard, discovering how to control their abilities to move objects and communicate telepathically. The girls felt stronger with each passing day, but a nagging worry still lingered in their hearts. One evening, as they practiced their skills, Mira turned to Leela. Are you ready for this? She asked, her brow furrowed. It feels like everything is about to change. Leela nodded but looked unsure. I'm scared, Mira. What if we fail? What if we can't save our people? Mira took a deep breath, trying to hide her own fears. We have to try. If we don't, who will? Our people need us, and we can't turn our backs on them. That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, the girls made their final decision. They would embrace their roles as princesses and return to the Sarathian Empire. It was time to face their destiny, no matter how frightening it seemed. The next day, Zorak gathered the crew on the ship. He explained that their enemies were growing stronger and more dangerous. The coalition of shadows has been attacking our borders, he said, his voice grave. If we do not act soon, we risk losing everything. Mira felt a chill run down her spine. The coalition of shadows was known for their ruthlessness. They had terrorized the Sarathian Empire for years. Now, they were closing in on the royal palace, eager to take advantage of the chaos. Are we ready? Leela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zorak turned to them, his eyes filled with determination. We will fight together. You are not alone in this battle. Your people will rally behind you. As the Starbreaker sped through space, Mira and Leela felt a mix of excitement and fear. The reality of what they were about to face began to sink in. Would they really be able to lead their people against the coalition? As they approached the planet, the girls looked out the window. The beauty of their home was breathtaking. Vast forests, shining lakes, and golden cities stretched below them. This was the place they were meant to protect. When the ship landed, they were greeted by a crowd of loyal citizens. They cheered and waved, their faces filled with hope. The girls stepped off the ship, feeling the weight of the moment. They were no longer just orphans. They were princesses returning to their rightful place. Zorak stepped forward, raising his voice to the crowd. People of the Sarathian Empire, your true princesses have returned to lead you. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the air. Mira and Leela smiled, feeling the warmth of their people's support. But deep down, they knew the real battle was yet to come. As night fell, the atmosphere grew tense. The sound of distant explosions echoed in the air. The coalition of shadows was attacking. They had come to reclaim their power and destroy the royal family once and for all. Zorak gathered the royal guards and explained the plan. We will divide our forces. Some will protect the palace, while others will fight back against the coalition. Mira and Leela, you must stay close to me. Your powers will be crucial in this battle. Mira and Leela nodded, their hearts pounding. They felt ready to fight, but the fear of failure still lingered. As the battle began, chaos erupted around them. Energy blasts filled the air, and the sounds of clashing weapons echoed in the night. Mira and Leela stood with Zorak, watching as their forces engaged the enemy. Now, use your powers, Zorak shouted over the noise. The girls focused, feeling the energy surge within them. They raised their hands, and a wave of energy surged forward, pushing back the enemies with great force. They were surprised by how powerful they felt together. Keep going, Zorak encouraged them. You can do this. As the battle raged on, the girls fought side by side, their bond growing stronger with each blast of energy. They moved gracefully through the chaos, helping their soldiers and inspiring hope. Suddenly, they spotted the leader of the coalition of shadows, a dark figure cloaked in black. He was powerful and ruthless, and his presence sent chills down their spines. There he is, Mira shouted. We have to stop him. Leela nodded, determination shining in her eyes. Together, they focused their energy, combining their powers into one powerful blast. They aimed at the dark figure, sending their energy forward. It hit him with a blinding light, causing him to stumble back. As the enemy leader fell, the tides of battle began to turn. Their forces rallied, gaining strength from the sight of their princesses fighting bravely. The coalition of shadows, shaken by the power of the royal sisters, started to retreat. With one final push, Mira and Leela unleashed their combined powers once more, creating a brilliant explosion of light that filled the battlefield. The enemy forces scattered, and victory was within their grasp. As the dust settled, the cheers of their people filled the air. Mira and Leela stood tall, breathing heavily but filled with pride. They had chosen their path, and they had fought bravely for their home. Together, we can face anything, Mira said, smiling at her sister. Leela beamed back, her heart full of hope. They were no longer just princesses. They were leaders, united with their people in a fight for peace and freedom. With their kingdom saved, they knew their journey was just beginning, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, side by side. This final part captures the climax of their journey, showcasing the girls' growth and determination as they embrace their identities and fight for their people. The language remains simple and engaging, highlighting the emotions and actions of the characters.